Nele. Obviously working for TradeMe. I've been with TradeMe for about 3 years. I'm a so-called test chapter lead. So-called chapter means it's a particular term we use at TradeMe. We can talk about that in the Q&A session. We're not going to touch on that at the moment. It's not really an introduction thing. Right, so TradeMe Auckland started 3 years ago. When I started, I was the first test engineer. And I was across all the verticals in commercial space. So at that time we had one squad or one team as those standards. Right now we have 7, and we're still growing. We're potentially going to go 10 plus very soon. So you're looking at what the growth of, or quite a significant one in about 3 years' time, or even less. All of that accumulates at this point to 8 testers plus an intern. We still think that the ratio of dev versus test is not adequate enough. So in other words, we are hiring, we are looking for testers in order to expand and accommodate that ratio. Right, so to talk about some proper stuff, today is Sean Cresswell.
So the reason I called on Nele into giving that little introduction is that we're actually going to pass over at some point. I'm going to get Nele to talk about some of the stuff that he's experienced with peering, specifically because we do have this Auckland office and we do have a Wellington office, so it does affect our peering quite a bit. But why peering? Probably to start off with, why I wanted to talk about peering. Nele and Branko have been saying to me, hey, look, WeTest in Auckland, they're a great group of people, we should come along and do a talk, or we should definitely host something at a new cool office in TradeMe. And I'd actually been sitting on a blog post for a while about peering and thought, well, these sort of forums are a great place to hear those blog posts to see if it's actually worth publishing, or if there's any actually other insights out there put into it. So this is loosely based on a blog post that's in draft on my computer at the moment. But that all kind of came about by some training sessions that we run. So at TradeMe, we run internal training sessions. As Nele mentioned, we've got 8 testers up here in Auckland. Down in Wellington, there's about another 20, and they're split into chapters. So building on what Nele said, a chapter works for a different part of the business. So we have a chapter that works on property, a chapter that works on motors, a chapter that works on ads, a chapter that works on jobs. And they are, for all intents and purposes, siloed into those chapters. They work together, they work on projects that they know about, but it's up to Nele kind of to enforce the processes and practices that I come up with as test manager. So I'm the test manager at TradeMe, but none of the testers at TradeMe have direct line management, like reporting lines to me. I've been at TradeMe for over 6 years now. I'm kind of an oldie around the TradeMe office. TradeMe is a young company, but yeah, for me, having been there for 6 years, I know far too much. I know enough to be dangerous, but also I don't have enough time to run around everybody and say, hey, this is how you do things. So Nele and I have a really close relationship when it comes to making sure that everybody knows what's going on and what their job is. But these training sessions, the way they work is somebody comes up with a topic and we run them with each of those chapters. So every 5 weeks or so I come up to Auckland and I facilitate a training session. The last one that we did was, one of the topics that we discussed was peering. And out of that training session, we started talking about peering more and more, which has been the blog post. Sorry, that's a very convoluted history of what we're talking about here. So, peering, there's lots of different definitions about peering. You can talk to people about, you talk to developers about peering. I'll talk to you about peer programming, where one steals the keyboard off the other one steals it back every 5 minutes. With testing, it's kind of harder to do that sort of thing. I don't know many testers that would let another tester take their keyboard without tapping on the screen saying, hey, test this thing, go and do that. So it's a little bit different. We operate a lot of what could be classified as testing activities here at TradeMe. Our testers are encouraged, peering activities. So our testers are encouraged to do peering activities. But we don't call them peering activities. They're second nature to us. And what I wanted to kind of talk to you guys about is the peering that we do, the reason that we do that peering, and kind of the successes, challenges, and things that have kind of worked for us, kind of our experiences around it. So one of the blog posts that I like, which you haven't read, if you haven't read, I highly recommend it, is a guy, Mike Talks, who's based down in Wellington. He writes a test blog called Test Sheet NZ. He wrote a really cool blog about pairing, and I'll probably reference it a couple of times. And after this, I highly recommend going and having a read of it. But quoting Mike, pairing is about getting insight and perspectives different from your own. And so when I talk about pairing, that's to me what pairing is, getting insights and perspectives that are different from your own, that modify your own perspectives. It's not necessarily reading somebody else's code, it's not necessarily reading somebody else's tests, it's about just changing your perspective. And because of that, I kind of think that any interaction a tester has is a type of pairing. If you're talking to somebody, you're pairing. If you're chatting in the coffee machine about what you're working on, it's a type of pairing. What we've found is that there are a number of different types of pairing that we need to put structure around, though, to kind of help different levels of testers, because not all testers are fluent in all different types of pairing. And Nele will talk about that a little bit later on. So historically, in Wellington, kind of before we had our Scrum teams, before we had our Auckland office, or 5 years ago, when there was only about 130 people in TradeMe, now there's 460. We operated in waterfall, pure waterfall, but very, very fast waterfall. So we were doing really short iterative projects. If you imagine a big open plan office, probably twice the size of this, floor space wise, all of the testers sat together, and all of the developers sat together, all of the DBAs sat together, and all of the BAs sat together. You all sat within your different functions, and we loved it. It was absolutely amazing. You got casual pairing happening all the time, every day. You could lean over to the tester sitting next to you and say, hey, how do you test this? You could lean over to your test manager and say, this is my test approach. Does that make sense? You could turn your screen around literally to the tester sitting next to you and say, this is how I've written my test case. Does that make sense? And that sort of pairing was great. Really instant feedback from people who knew what you did as a job and people that could actually suggest different ways to tackle problems. That was great. We loved it. Casual pairing happened all the time. And it actually made our team really, really close to knit. We hung out all the time, we went to lunch all the time, and felt like a little family. Then Scrum came along, and we got separated. And I won't lie, there were tears. People didn't want to leave the safe, literally, called it the nest of the testers. We had this little zone which was ours, and the test manager was, at the time could stand up and tell developers to go away if things got heated or conversations got heated. So there was a real fear that you're going to get siloed into working in these Scrum teams and you wouldn't get to talk to another tester. On the flip side of it, looking back at it now, working in Scrum teams, and even when we worked in that waterfall environment, testers were testing one thing at a time from one particular developer. Or they were testing one thing from two developers or from a particular BA, or something that they'd been given by one person, but they weren't sitting anywhere near that person. Developers were on the other side of the office. So if they wanted to pair with that developer, they literally had to get up out of their seat and look across and chat to them, or, heaven forbid, send them an email, rewrite the email and make it nicely formalised, removing any casual interaction because they wanted these exact questions answered. And that was the only, like in that waterfall environment, or when we were separated into functions, that was the only pairing that was going on. It was a really formalised relationship. We didn't have this casual pairing like we had as testers. Flipping into Scrum, pairing went through the roof because you were working on this thing and the person that developed it was sitting right next to you. So of course you had 50 million questions about how they built it, why they'd chosen to build it that way. Had they not read the requirements? Did they not talk to the DBA about how the tables were structured? All of these questions got fired straight at the developer and you got a really short turnaround time. There was no waiting on email. There was no waiting on instant messenger to be ignored and then replied to. There was no, shall we say, confusion about requirements because you could have that real casual pairing just happening face to face. Did we lose our testers pairing? Not so much. Testers still chatted to each other. And we have an instant messenger window. Now we have a hip chat window where all the testers still talk to each other. But the amount of pairing is much better spent in that Scrum time rather than with those testers. So just building on that Scrum sort of relationship a bit more, when somebody's right next to you and not on the other side of the office, you can see their body language. And so if you're sending an email to a developer, quite often you don't have any body language cues or any communication cues that you can see from your developer. You can't tell if they're actually understanding the question that you're asking. Whereas if you look at somebody and you say, hey, tell me how this is built, you can quite quickly see if they actually understand what your question is, or if they're lying about how they know that it's implemented. Not that our developers lie in Wellington. And right about the same time we switched to Scrum, we hired the guy in the blue shirt, and he started in our Auckland team, where things are a little bit different.
Okay, so I've started, and we're thinking we're going to go agile. It's a challenge for all of us. All of us were new. It was just myself and 2 developers. First of all, perfect ratio. We soon hired another individual, but had one of the devs working more like a lead again, going to that agile 2.7 perfect ratio. So from that perspective, everything looked okay. And in all honesty, it did, simply because we've had a lot of room to move, in other words, experiment. We've adopted a lot of different ways of running meetings. We've started with 4-week sprints. I presume most of us have at least had some exposure to Agile here. Is there anyone who hasn't at all? No? So you can see that it's now becoming more of a norm, whereas 3+ years ago it was more like a fashion term. A lot of companies wanted to use it. I've been at certain places, large corporate places, where they call themselves Agile, but in my opinion it's far from it. It was very much by the book, which you can see at the end of the day it was done in sort of a shorter waterfall chunks. Not discrediting their efforts, but to come to that stage, something that we've allowed, and from what my observation is that they haven't, is the room to move. So our retrospective, or things that happen at the end of the sprint, every retrospective for us was different, until we've kind of, to say, adopted the one that works for us, but every once in a while, instead of making it standard, we would still change it just so that it breaks that monotony. So that's how I started. Pairing up with anybody, I really couldn't. What we had back then was a chat or a link window where we'd log in and talk to other testers. It was strictly testers chat, but we've discovered that when you're doing your work, and that's again my philosophy, that we shouldn't multitask, and nobody can multitask. Again, that's me, could be highly controversial. But when we had that link window, every time someone asks a question and you're doing your work on your left screen, and at some stages we only had one screen, you could see it kind of flickering, blinking, and that was a huge distraction. So people started raising that, and thanks to Sean, who's quite open to these things, we adopt new things and new ideas. So we weren't really, at some stages perhaps by the book just to see how it works, but the more we see that it's not working, and the fact that we were open to new ideas, things started happening for us quickly, and we were able to experiment. So starting as the only tester, the only people, not the only people, but at least in Auckland that I could rely on body language were the developers. We did not have BAs. I presume some of you come from highly structured environments where you have your specification documents or your requirements, I don't know, say 30, 40 pages for a particular small feature. We did not have any of that, so it was pretty much the verbal that we used to get from devs. Sounds risky, you'd say, for a website that does so well in New Zealand, but I highly believe that it's because of these practices that we've adopted that kept our engagement into the product, and therefore us taking ownership. So I've had developers to talk to, and that was really it. So I would sometimes get into some form of an argument with Sean telling me, well, you can't ask devs all the time for certain guidance, and it's true. But I was merely asking, I presume, for the more of a are we on the same page type of advice rather than hey, how would you test it? For us again, it was a lot more flexible. We didn't have anything structured here. We were feeding off Wellington, but the main thing that helped us all at that point was the fact that we were all new. Moving on from there, we've expanded to a few additional testers, and at that point we could start to look and structure certain things. So we've had, I'm not sure if you've actually touched on it, but we've had an official 5-week period where we do the testing, where we have regular catch-ups to make sure that people are doing their work correctly or as per certain standards. And that grew. And that was okay. That became a standard again. But we found ourselves, I'm kind of speed tracking, we found ourselves where our trade me senior management, they decided to invest a lot of money into resourcing, in other words, expanding. So we found ourselves with new people coming on board, and that's happening even now. It has been like that for the past year, where you have brand new teams. So with brand new teams, you have limited resourcing where people can come in and help. So we had to let go of some individuals and rely on their expertise in order to handle the duties that they have. We were still around, so we formed, again, not sure if you touched on this, a buddy system where you're with someone for 6 months. You're not right on their shoulder, but you're there kind of overseeing things and making sure that it's progressing, that you're actually doing the meaningful work. How it happened in Auckland, I think it was a mini set of all of this. I don't think we've implemented one single strategy that I can talk about and say this is how it is and it's definitely going to work. It was a lot more on, right, well, let's experiment a little bit, all to within certain limits, and see whether that works for you or for this squad. And that's what helped us a lot, and I believe that's how we got engaged and took ownership, like I spoke to before. What helped us in this case with Trade Me, and I really believe that we're one of the unique environments where you do end-to-end testing, and your almost sole responsibility at the end of their life cycle is making sure that the case that you've been working on gets deployed. It's something called the gatekeeping, I'm sure, or I hope that you've heard of that team. You had to be on alert, your communication had to be at a particular level. We do have the tools and processes that were structured for that. So outside of that, everything else was kind of ad hoc. And it sounds scary, but again, we do rely on people's expertise. So going back to what I first talked about, us needing to hire. When we hire, we look for individuals that can perhaps bring that on board. Certain people that, yes, we do want to develop, but if we see that in their character they can stand their ground when it comes to tough times, that they have good enough EQ, emotional intelligence, we are happy to give this person a chance, obviously, to prove themselves and help us when the times go bad, if I could say. And they can go bad during these difficult times. Why I'm saying all of this is that we tend to throw people in the fire a little bit. At the moment they're going to get burned, we pull them out. And that's, okay, kind of sounds like we're controlling it. Sounds scary, but it's one of the ways that we had to cope with growth or lack of resources to oversee properly, okay, if I could say the word properly. And because of all of this, I believe we've actually created people who take ownership of their particular space and become SMEs, subject matter experts.
So when we first hired Nele up in Auckland, for us in Wellington, and I'm sure anyone that's worked in a product before, so not just project testing, but a product, hiring a brand new team, geo-located miles away from you, freaked us out in Wellington. Because we were so used to being able to pair casually and pair with our developers and pair with each other, that all of a sudden we were hiring these people in Auckland and we had to pair using TV screens, and that required booking a meeting. and making sure people were available and making sure the room was available. And it became really, really off-putting. And Nele will remember fondly the number of times that I just picked up the phone and said, hey, tell me what's going on. Or talk to me about how you're testing this thing. Or have you spoken to your developers? Don't believe them. These sort of conversations we're having. And we really had to figure out ways that made us comfortable because we loved pairing so much, but at the same time didn't mean that Nele was double checking everything with me. And that's a really important thing for me, and Nele kind of mentioned it before, that I like to see myself as this big friendly cat sitting over all the testers who are kind of little mice. And if you ever watch a cat play with a mouse and it just grabs their tail every now and again, I'm not going to eat Nele, I'm not going to destroy him, but I just need to stop him every now and again and be like, hey, can we chat? And that kind of works. It kind of works. But when we get 8 testers in Auckland, 8 mice for 1 cat, yeah, you're not going to keep track of them. So eventually, Nele becomes the guy who can do that pairing locally and becomes that subject matter expert because he knows what my subject matter is, what I care about as a tester, as a test manager. And so that's kind of a different way of thinking about pairing. It's not just from your business rules knowledge or from your testing expertise, it's also from your process and your strategy and knowing what your boss cares about. It can all be different ways of pairing with people and making sure that you're upskilling them and giving them different perspectives on how work should get done. Leading kind of on from that, I wanted to talk about another type of pairing which I didn't really realise was happening until quite recently. We run Agile, as we've talked about, and I'll kind of cover this really quickly, but feel free to hit us up for questions. We run Agile, we do all of the cool meetings and processes that come with Agile. So we have backlog grooming sessions, and we have sprint planning sessions, and we have daily stand-ups. And they are all pairing, no matter which way you cut them. Backlog grooming sessions, you're sitting in a room with a couple of developers saying, tell me how you're going to build that. Well, why don't we try it this way? And the developers are asking you, hey, how are you going to test this? So I make sure that I write my unit tests to help you out, or I write hooks to help you out. That's totally types of pairing. And we hadn't really thought of them as pairing exercises. We thought of them as going in and proving how much you know and stumping the developers because they couldn't answer your questions, which is also a type of pairing. Our BAs love it because our BAs come in wanting us to size things, and the developer will throw down a 13 and the tester will throw down a 2. And a fight ensues as you pair, and it's a pairing fight. Or around the other way is always more entertaining, and Natalia's nodding because I'm sure she was in many meetings where she threw down a 21 and the developer threw down a 2. Daily stand-ups give you the perfect opportunity to pair, and if you've listened to, can't remember the names off the top of my head, but Testing in the Pub, which is a podcast from some guys in the UK, highly recommend listening to it. There is a bit of pub background noise, but otherwise they do talk about testing and not about the pub. But one thing they chat about is daily stand-ups. When your developer says, I've just built this and I didn't compile my code properly and I found this bug, but it's okay, I fixed it. And you as a tester goes, sorry, what now? And that's perfect pairing because you're getting a different perspective. You're getting the developer's perspective of the code and how fragile it is and the fact that it broke when you tried to touch it. And that then spawns another conversation where you can grab that developer and drag them into a room and say, so explain to me how the code works. Why is it so fragile? What do I need to change for my tester program? Likewise, if a tester stands up and says, I was testing this thing and then I remembered save search emails. And save search emails use the same search props that we've just changed. And the developer goes, sorry, what? What are save search emails? I've never heard about those things before. All of that information transition, all of that insight that you're getting is changing the perspective about how you're going to approach your daily job. The last things that we just want to touch on, I'll steal one of Nele's points. Communication skills are really important in pairing, and we've found it really interesting that we hire people who are, as Nele said, have a high EQ, they can communicate well. Agile processes, when you're teaching people how to do grooming, when you're teaching people how to do stand-ups, can take somebody who doesn't have great communication skills and actually make it easier for them to do pairing, because you give them a structure. So right, this stand-up, ask these questions and listen to what's going on. They don't have to feel like they have to walk up to a developer and say, excuse me, can you tell me how the code works? That freaks testers out. That freaks a lot of people who are more on the introvert scale, perhaps, out from going up to people and saying, hey, tell me how you test it, how you built this thing so I can test it. Agile processes take that barrier away. We've had so many success stories with interns, especially, but also junior testers who are scared of these big developers who've been at the company for years, and they don't feel like they can go up to them and say, can I peer with you and you tell me how this works? Agile's kind of solved that for a lot of our testers. The last thing I really want to quickly go through, so I'm running out of time, and Nele's actually printed out some documents which you'll throw on some tables later on. We do test run reviews. So at TradeMe, we don't write test scripts, we write test conditions. We're trying to prove test conditions all the time. It's just the way we've always tested. We don't write really detailed test plans. We don't write the environments that we're going to use. We don't do any of that. But what we do is we write these test conditions and they go through a peer review process. And that peer review process is a type of peering. Because I write a test run, me as test manager still test things. I write a test run and I send it out to all the testers and say, hey, I've just written this, can someone review it for me? Somebody picks it up, one or two people might pick it up and have a read of it. The main thing they're looking for is your test approach. What's in scope, what's not out, what's not in scope, how are you going to test this thing? But that gives them a chance to pair with you. What's the word I'm looking for? It's like an icebreaker, a pairing icebreaker. You've asked for help. And another tester who goes, hey, I recognise this. I can help you test that. I've tested it before. Or actually, that sounds really scary. I'm going to be nosy and see what's going on here. What it also does is the person who's reviewing all of a sudden becomes a subject matter expert in the area that you're testing in without even having tested it, because they've reviewed your test work. And that kind of propagates that knowledge and removes that knowledge gap. We find it's really, really, really handy for testers who maybe lean on the exhaustive side of testing, because somebody who knows that subject matter will come in and say, you don't need to be exhaustive, or target your regression a little bit more, or maybe try a different risk approach when you're testing this. And we've actually noticed that our throughput, the number of cases that we're getting out, is going up, as well as the complexity of things that we're getting at is going up, to which I heavily, I'm not saying it was just because it was my idea, but I heavily attribute to that pairing process. Testers are more confident in the testing that they're doing on really complex stuff because that knowledge base is being kind of tapped into. And it's not a traditional pairing sort of way. And most people you talk to say, oh, you should pair by going and sitting with somebody and talking it through with them. We are doing these reviews by email most of the time, or by phone, pick it up and just chat to them. But I know Prey is one of our new testers and loves test run reviews. And 9 times out of 10 will just reply to me and goes, how do you know all this stuff? And I say, well, because I've paired with other people. It's not because I'm the only person that knows it. It's because that giant pairing circle that we have working works quite well. Right, before Morris throws something at me. Little blind person. I guess the main thing for us, or our main experience with pairing, is kind of first-hand accounts. So like what I just said, Prey saying to us, hey, this test run review process, it's amazing. It makes me feel so much more confident in my testing. Developers and Scrum teams coming up to us and say, hey, I know what the tester's doing now. That makes me way more confident that my tester is covering all of the code that I've gone through and not spending hours testing stuff I haven't touched. Our product managers are coming to us and saying, hey, I feel a lot better about hiring this new tester because you have this pairing system in place and this tester's not left by themselves. Probably the biggest thing is for me being located in Wellington and Nele being located in Auckland. I know that pairing exists up here, so I can kind of sleep easy at night with all these changes that we're pumping out to production. We deploy 9 times a week, morning and afternoon. We have 28 testers working on sprints, so every 2 weeks they probably deploy 3 or 4 things. So it's a huge amount of change going out in the sun. And I can go to bed and forget about work because I know that that pairing's happening and supporting each other. Yep. That's going to be. So Nele has received a couple of emails from me where I've gone to them and said, hey, I looked at Aucklanders, they're just redoing the Aucklanders test runs, because we naturally have that social interaction with people as well. And so you go, oh yeah, Nele's my mate, I'll review his stuff.
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
So what we find is that people do play favourites. They know that they like reading Bree's test runs, so they'll review her stuff more often. and Aucklanders, they go out for coffee all the time, so they're mates, so they review their friends' stuff. So yeah, we do actively try and discourage it. I keep a report in the background that shows me how many people are reviewing and where they're reviewing, so we can kind of identify outliers. But we're not big bullies about it. We treat everybody like adults. It's one of our favourite things kind of to say at trade meetings, that everyone is an adult, so we treat them like adults. But likewise, humans like being comfortable. So if you're reviewing something because you're comfortable reviewing it, it's kind of natural.
So when you mention devs, if you look at these little flow charts, you can see a stage where we encourage testers to go to developers. This is predominantly so that we make sure that what's been verbally said to us by devs after the script is completed, that we're now on the same page. It doesn't mean that devs are telling us how to test. It just means, yep, that's what I meant when I was telling you that. Whether it's formal, I've talked about how we've refined our processes over the years now. I've been in a very corporate environment where you have to schedule it and it lasts an hour, and you have a person who's documenting, taking notes, and you have someone else who's kind of asking all sorts of questions. It's not like that with us. Sean mentioned that it's mainly over the email. Because you've got a record where you can keep things and go back to it if you need to retweak your test cases. We can, in order to cut down on time, do something like over-the-shoulder review, meaning sitting next to someone and this person drives and you give suggestions. So it's not formal in the sense of, or it's not as official in the sense of it has to be booked for an hour, it has to be done with this many people, blah, blah. No, it's more on, well, let me see what I can do to help you.
Yeah, the only part that becomes official is we do mandate that every test run does get reviewed before it goes out, but we don't mandate that it's documented somewhere or that we have a form that gets filled out.